Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we begin Chapter 4 of Alice Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, and it's simply called Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Are you ready to meet them? I sure am. So, if you're ready, I'll begin. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm around the other's neck, and Alice knew which was which in a moment, because one of them had Dum embroidered on his collar, and the other D. I suppose they've each got Tweedle around at the back of the collar, she said to herself. They stood so still that she quite forgot they were alive, and she was just looking round to see if the word Tweedle was written at the back of each collar, when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked Dum. "If you think we're waxworks," he said, "you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made for looking at for nothing, oh-how." "Contrariwise," added the one marked D, "if you think we're alive, you ought to speak." "I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help saying them out loud. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. "I know what you're thinking about," said Tweedledum, "but it isn't so nohow." "Contrariwise," continued Tweedledee, "if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be. But it isn't, it ain't. That's logic." "I was thinking," Alice said very politely, "which is the best way out of this wood? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please?" But the little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, "First boy." "No how!" Tweedledum cried out briskly and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he would only shout out contrariwise, and he did. "You've been wrong," said Tweedledum. "The first thing in a visit is to say, 'How d'ye do?' and shake hands." And here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out the two hands that were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings. So, as the best way out of the difficulty, she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment, they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural, she remembered afterwards, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done, as well as she could make out, by the branches rubbing across the other, like fiddles and fiddlesticks. "But it certainly was funny," Alice said afterwards, when she was telling her sister the history of all this, "to find myself singing 'Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush.' I don't know when I began it, but I somehow felt as if I had been singing it a very long time." The other two dancers were fat and very soon out of breath. "4 times round is enough for one dance," Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as it had begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been dancing with. It would never do to say, "How do you do," now, she said to herself. We seem to have got beyond that somehow. "I hope you're not much tired," she said at last. "No how, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Yes, pretty well, some poetry," Alice said doubtfully. Would you tell me which road leads out of the wood? What shall I repeat to her? Said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes, and not noticing Alice's question. The walrus and the carpenter is the longest, Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. The sun was shining. Here, Alice ventured to interrupt him. If it's very long, she said as politely as she could, would you please tell me first which road? Tweedledee smiled again gently, and began once more. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all its might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud, because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny breach. We cannot do with more than 4, to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter, they thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so nice of you to come, and you are very nice. The carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing, but the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none, and that was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because, you see, he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front, so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise. That was mean, said Alice indignantly. Then I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began. Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here? She asked timidly. It's only the Red King snoring, said Tweedledee. Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, what an interesting rhyme and twist to this chapter. I wonder what's going to happen when they see the Red King. Tune in tomorrow to find out more. My name's been Sascha Cooper, and this has been Alice Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Take care, everybody. See you tomorrow, and stay safe. Bye-bye.